you wanted the best, you've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com. Welcome to the show, my friends, family, and friends. In post, we're going to edit that. Like, no one will know the difference that even happened. So, that's we need to talk to her agent, make sure she doesn't preeminent me anymore. Anyway, guys, as always, we have the most amazing authors, minds on the show, all the brilliant people who come share their stories and journeys and educate you to make you smarter. And that way, when you go to cocktail parties, does anybody go to cocktail parties? Was it like 1960s here? That way, when you go to those cocktail parties and you're holding that espresso margaritas and you're trying to look smart, you can just quote stuff from the Chris Voss Show and people will be like in awe. Anyway, go to goodreads.com, Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com, Chris Voss, Chris Voss 1 on the TikTokity, and all those crazy places on the internet. Opinions expressed by guests on the podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the host or the Chris Voss Show. Some guests of the show may buy advertising on the podcast, but it is not an endorsement or review of any kind. Today, an amazing young man on the show. We're going to be talking about his hot new book, and it is entitled The Constitution Kids, out February 11th, 2025, by Gary Gabel. We're going to get into it with him, his insights, and learn about this document. It's like really important, especially in today's world in 2025. It's something we need to preserve, because democracy dies in darkness. Let's give it the Washington Post. Gary Gabel is the visionary behind the Constitution Kids, blending historical wisdom and engaging storytelling. His mission is to bring civic understanding to the next generation through meaningful, accessible education. He's the author and entrepreneur known for his contributions to personal development, leadership training. He's authored several books, including Personal Takeover, Create a Personal Life Full of Optimism, Energy, and Impact, The Day One, The First Steps to a Meaningful Life. I obviously skipped that book and have my life has no meaning other than doing the podcast. So I got that going for me. And the Constitution Kids. Well, I should have read his book. Darn it. Gary, welcome to the show, Gary. How are you?
Good, great. Glad to be here.
Give us your .coms. Where do you want people to find out more about you on the interwebs?
They can find it at theconstitutionkids.com. That's the website for the book.
So give us your overview of what's inside your new book, The Constitution Kids.
Well, The Constitution Kids, to talk about the book, it really, first of all, it was written, I wrote it because the Constitution itself is a relatively dry document. It's not easy to read. And as a result, most people have not read it. And in fact, if you think back to school, most of us really didn't learn much about the Constitution in either high school or even in college. Unless you were in the law school or something, you really didn't get a lot. You'd get a touch of it in a government or political science course, but that's about it. So I wrote this book, and I thought, let me write a book that brings life to the Constitution. It really makes it alive for people. Mm-hmm. So I did it through the eyes of 3 15-year-old teenagers who live in a small town in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. And basically, Chris, the way it works is the kids, it starts out at summer, and they hear that there's a protest going down at City Hall. They go there on their bikes, and they find that people are protesting outside the library wanting to ban books. And while the kids are there, they see some adults also with guns, carrying guns. And they inquire, and the adults are saying, well, it's my right under the Constitution to bear arms, to carry this gun and that. And the kids are a bit confused by that. They go home and they say to one of the moms, they say, we don't really know that much about the Constitution, but people were talking about it at this protest today. So the mother says, one of the kids says, kids, it's summer. Why don't you go to the library and get a book and learn about it? So they go there. Well, the 3 kids are Alex, Roman, and Callie. Alex is a great communicator. Roman's a bit of an inventor, kind of like a MacGyver type of person. And Callie is an intuitive empath. And so they go to the library, and the librarian sends them back to the stacks. She says, there are some books on the Constitution back in the stacks, the back part of the library. They go in there, and Callie, who is the intuitive empath, is walking down an aisle, and suddenly a book pushes itself off the shelf and falls at her feet. She looks down at it, and it's called The Living Constitution. She says, guys, come here. You aren't going to believe what I just found. They come over, they said, oh, only you would have this happen to you. They take it over and put it on a table, and suddenly the book opens up, and out from the book emerges a hologram of Ben Franklin. And he says, yes, this is the Living Constitution, and I'm here. My job is to help people learn about the Constitution through this book. Well, then what happens here, he ends up taking them to Constitution Hall to 1787 when the Constitution is ratified. And he said, nobody's going to see you. He said, we're going to be able to transport you immediately there. Nobody there will see or hear you, but you'll be able to see and hear everything that's going on. That's the beginning of the book. They go there when it's originally ratified. They see George Washington, James Madison, other people there as they're debating the Constitution, getting ready to ratify. Well, what I've done then, Chris, is I've had them meet every day. They go and they learn something more about the Constitution. They learn about the amendments by various people, historical figures who were involved in those actual amendments or are telling them about why that amendment was so important to their particular life. So they meet people, both famous people and less famous people, both Americans and international figures like Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn and Albert Einstein and other people throughout the book. So they meet a number of historical figures who help them learn about it. And that's basically the book. And I did it with the kids because I felt that these kids with their different personalities would bring a good set. They bring some humor to the story. They converse with one another in different ways, and they're conversing with the historical figures. Helps really people. It brings the whole thing to life for the people who read the book.
And why is the Constitution important in your mind?
It's really the underpinning of our country. I mean, if you think about it, we're the American experiment here, and we differ from all of the autocratic systems, monarchies in the past, because we had a constitution that limited what the government would do, what the federal government could do, and it also, for the first time in history pretty much, gave individual citizens in the United States rights. The individual rights, and it protected those rights, and it also protected states' rights too. It's a very, very important document, and again, it's helped. You think about even the separation between the three areas of government: the executive branch, the legislative, and judicial. The Constitution is what separates those three branches and keeps them independent from one another. So it's a very critical document. And and you think about the amendments. I mean, the right to vote. One of the amendments, of course, gave blacks the right to vote, former slaves. Then we had the women given the right to vote eventually. And, then you also have, all kinds of things in terms of protected gun ownership through the Second Amendment, the freedom of speech in the First Amendment. Those are very, very important things. And again, it's critical to us.
Yeah. And it's so important. I mean, have you ever read the Federalist Papers? I'm sure you have.
I read them years ago.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I always recommend to people when they always start citing it seems like anybody online these days that cites the Constitution. Well, the Constitution says, I'm always like, yeah, there's another person who hasn't read it. Does it seem that way, or am I just kind of biased that way? But yeah, it seems like anybody who's talking about the Constitution online, or they've got they're claiming they're a patriot, or they've got something on their truck that, whatever. I'm like, yep, there's a person who's never read the Constitution.
That's very, very true. I mean, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And the interesting thing is I've had a number of adults read this book, people who are lawyers, people with doctorates. I've had people in Mensa read it, and I can tell you almost to a person, they've raved about the book. These are adults. It's really targeted to adults and teenagers. And a lot of these people have said, Gary, I've learned things about the Constitution I never even knew before. And it's really interesting. And again, that's why I wrote the book the way I did, because it would be to make it fun to read and at the same time to make it very palatable. It's very palatable. It's very understandable because real life historical figures are helping to teach. I mean, if you look at something as simple as prohibition and the end of prohibition, the kids end up meeting Eliot Ness. They end up in Chicago when Eliot Ness and his untouchables raid one of the distilleries, one of the warehouses with all the booze in it and everything like that. They end up on a boat between Windsor and Detroit, coming over with the Purple Gang as they're sneaking booze into Detroit from Windsor, which was a famous route for alcohol to come in the United States. So they really learn through all kinds of different people. They learn about the Second Amendment. Wyatt Earp actually takes them to Tombstone, and they're there where he explains why his brother Virgil, who's the sheriff of Tombstone, put in gun control because people were going nuts in Tombstone. And Wyatt said, in most of the country, there was no problem with gun ownership. But in some cities like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood, it was all out of hand. And so he actually takes them, they see the gunfight at the OK Corral. And so they learn that. And then they end up going over to Germany, and they meet Albert Einstein before he and his family fled Germany. And they're there at Kristallnacht, the night when the Germans are breaking windows in synagogues and everything like that. So and Albert Einstein talks about how the Germans controlled guns and took them away from all of the Jewish people. He said, so we couldn't defend ourselves at all against Hitler and the brown shirts. So again, they're learning those things. So I try to make it very palatable that way.
Yeah. And I mean, this is important to learn. I mean, why we have our democracy, et cetera, why it's important, why we fought fascism in Germany and somehow now we're back, and why we don't allow kings, why we don't allow all that good stuff. And I think it's great that you've targeted this towards young people, because it seems like they're the ones who really lost this, for years now, decades actually. There's, people that have been trying to subvert education, taking away civics. And so they don't learn these things. They don't learn, the most important fabric of our foundation. And of course, if, I want to suggest to people, read the Constitution if you haven't in a long time, and also read the Federalist Papers, because, they sit down and explain. And they're kind of selling it to the colonials. They were explaining and selling why they were making decisions. Why did they leave the voting to the states instead of the federal government? And all these different things as to why our government functions and why we're seeing some of these things unravel is discerning to be worried about. So I like how you put this in children's ages. What sort of ages are good for the book, do you think?
Actually, it's really I targeted for adults and teens and tweens. Mm-hmm. I'd say anyone probably from 11 years on up can read the book. Definitely teenagers should read it. And I would say adults too, because again, as I mentioned, I can give you an example. The editor of our local magazine for the Mensa of Southeastern, I'm in Southeastern Michigan, and Mensa in Southeastern Michigan, she read the book and she raved about it. She's the editor of the magazine, and she said, I love this book. She said, this should be a movie. And again, the reason is, like you just said, Chris, you said you recommended for people to read the Federalist Papers and the Constitution. The problem is, once they start trying to read the Constitution, they get bogged down because it's drier. There's verbiage from going back from the 1700s and that. There's a lot of difficulty for people. And so that's, again, why I wrote it, because I tried to make it so that they're learning about each amendment and why it's important, but they're learning it through the eyes of people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who ends up teaching about the Fifth Amendment. They learn it through various people, both famous people and not so famous people. They meet Birch Bayh, they meet John Kennedy, they meet Colin Powell, they meet a ton of different people who, in each case, are teaching them something. Colin Powell, for instance, they meet him over in Vietnam, where they see the kids fighting, young people who are complaining and saying, God, I got to go over here and fight for the United States, but I can't vote yet. And Clubhouse says, see, this is why it was so important for them to be able to get the right to vote, for us to bring it down to 18 years old. So they learn it that way. If they try just to read the Constitution, it bogs down. It bogs down by going through that. So this tends to make it a lot easier and tends to make it much more vivid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely something that can help identify this. Maybe you should do a second book on the. Of course, it's pretty huge. The Federalist Papers.
Yeah,
quite huge. Yeah. What was the question I had for you? Do you see a continuation of this book? I noticed that you bring them to several different historical people in life. Do you see any sequels or continuation of the book?
I haven't thought about that yet. I've been so busy focused on just talking to people about the book and, again, getting the word out about the book. That's, again, the biggest challenge. You know, if I were famous, if I were Barack Obama and wrote this book, people would be buying it like crazy. For me, as being a person who's not famous, I've got to get the book out. So my focus right now is that. I'll deal with the whole question of like even something like the Federalist Papers later on.
Sure.
After I see the biggest challenge again is getting traction, making sure this is getting in the hands of people. And I've certainly hoped that educators will pick it up. I've got several different vehicles that I'm using to try to get it in front of educators so they can see that they can use it. And I've had several superintendents talk about how good the book is. And again, I'm hoping it'll fall in the hands of teachers who say, I'm going to use this book to help the kids, to help my students, both in college and in high school, learn about the Constitution.
I love it because we need more people. I mean, it's astounding to me. People talk to them like they'll cite the Constitution. I'm like, when's the last time you read it? And they're like, and even I hadn't read it in a long time. And suddenly 2016, I think for obvious reasons, I sat down and went, I need to read this document. And a lot of the Pulitzer Prize winning journalists and other journalists and TV anchors and news people that we've had on the show, we've probably had all the great we've had all the great New York Times, Washington Post, we've had all these great Time Magazine, all these great journalists on the show. And what's always interesting to me is they keep a copy of the Constitution on them.
I know
at all times. And I had somebody, I think from CNN, and they go, yeah, keep mine right here in my pocket. And I was like, wow. And they're like, because it's so important, and because for them, the freedom of the press, they understand the importance of it. They understand the importance of having a free press and everything else. We never had anybody from Fox News on. I'm not sure why, but we just do true news sources, not state media. But it's interesting to me how valuable it is and how important the press recognizes that. And the press gets a lot of shit. Like I have a lot of people online that I ain't the press, and it, one of my favorite things is they're always like, well, the press seems to be really, focused and complaining about one person. I'm like, you do understand the press's job is to cover the president, right? Anything he says, if he farts, if he stubs his toe, if he says something goofy, it's their job to report it. If you haven't noticed, they kind of do that with every president. And then if you have a president who says a lot of stupid shit or falls down the stairs, I remember, who's that Dan Quayle guy? George Bush. Anytime he'd say some sort of gaffe, they'd be like, he said some stupid shit over here. And that's their job, is to point it out. But some people misconstrue that and they go, oh, well, they're being biased. They're always complaining about him. It's like, no, that's kind of what they do with everybody, And I remember, I can't remember who it was. I had one of the famous Pulitzer Prize winner, I think Nancy, I can't pull her name right now. She wrote a great book on the Secret Service fucking up lately. And, she talked and she says, Chris, we try and cover everybody the same because people in positions of power will always fuck up something and they'll try and hide it. Or they'll try and, spin it or PR it, and we try and get to the truth. And, sometimes they've got to spend years cutting through that. You saw that with the President's Men, with what's his face, with Nixon and all that sort of good stuff. So now I noticed in the book they travel to other countries like Russia. I had a friend I was talking to today whose family escaped Russia in the 60s or 70s. And, we were talking about how different it is and why Russians don't really adopt democracy, because they never had it. They don't even know how it works.
Right.
Or, they have a value system to it. They've always lived under tyranny. And it's maybe comfortable for them. I don't know. But
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, but why did you put that in the book?
Well, I did because I wanted them to see, again, the difference between the United States and other countries. So, in fact, when they go they go to Ukraine, but they also go to Russia. And when they're in Russia, they actually meet Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn at the Gulag. He's in the Gulag, and it's not him himself. What happens in each case is a variation of him comes out of, they see him working in a field at the Gulag, but then an image of him emerges from him and comes over and is talking to him. And he says, and this image says, do you know why I'm here? Why I'm here? I'm in this Gulag. And the reason why I'm here is all I did was I wrote a letter to a friend of mine criticizing Joseph Stalin. That's all I did. I merely criticized him in a letter to a friend of mine. And as a result of that, I was put in this Gulag. Yeah. So they see that. In the Ukraine example, they're in Ukraine, they're Donetsk, this is a year ago, in Donetsk, where the Russians are there, and people are in a fallout shelter there, and people are starving there and everything like that. The kids see what it's like, and they hear that the Russians who have occupied it are stealing from the people, are taking things, are taking their homes, taking their goods, and the people have nothing there. So I try to use those examples in other countries to distinguish them from us. They also see, though, things like, in one case, they go to World War II. In World War II, they go to a German town where the Allies, the Americans, are coming into the town, and the German army is gone. The head of the town meets them, and the head of our army says, I want you to give us the best places to stay and give us food and everything like that, and orders him to do that. Again, that's another reason why one of the amendments to the Constitution prohibits us from doing that, prohibits soldiers from forcing other people to quarter the soldiers, to take care of them like that. So again, these are used as examples of the difference and why the Constitution is so important here and what it's done to protect us and to keep us safe.
So important and everything else. On your website, are the things that you offer any services or coaching or consulting? I mean, do you go out and speak maybe to groups or anything like that?
I do speak to groups, yes. The website really primarily shows quotes from people who reviewed the book, reviews, things that people have said about the book. It also has links. It gives my autobiography, or a biography of me. It also has links for them to buy the book, whether it's at Mascot Books, the publisher, or to go to Amazon for a Kindle copy or whatever. So it gives them various options.
Well, I think this is really important, especially since we have this issue with, people not being educated. I really think, there should be it should be like a driver's license. Every 4 years, maybe you should read the Constitution. And I think the Federalist Papers, I had never read the Federalist Papers up until I think it was about 2017. It's hard to believe that was 8 years ago. And I finally sat down and read them, and they're quite lengthy because they're trying to sell. This was stuff that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Madison and them were trying to sell to the thing, and they were anonymously doing it. They're like, well, and then I think at one point they were saying, this is what we're talking about in the meeting we're having to try and figure all this stuff out. So correct me if I'm wrong in any of that. And so they explain the why, because I remember when there was discussion about whether or not the election was stolen, and there was concern about, the federal government really needs to take over voting. And I think there's a push to that again. And the reason why Madison and the others argued that the states should control the voting is to make sure that there isn't tyranny of the federal government, where the federal government can't play king and go, yeah, we're just not going to do that election thing anymore. Or what you have in Russia, where there's a wink and nod voting system where it's like, oh yeah, those votes count, just send them all to central office and I'm sure that they'll get counted appropriately. Oh, by the way, Putin won by 110%.
Right.
I think they do that in North Korea. They're like, yeah, he won by 150%. They're like, wait, how does that work? There's no one dissenter, but how's that work? And they're like, well, he's, if you've ever heard the North Korean thing, I think he was born out of God's womb in the sky or some shit. So yeah, and he plays golf with a perfect 0 or something. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe that's his bowling score. I don't remember which one of those ways it goes. So as we go out, pitch to people why it's important to understand the Constitution, why it's important for them to value it, and why it's important for them to pick up your book, of course.
Well, I think, again, it's important because it is important. I said this earlier, it's the underpinning of the United States. Mm-hmm. It's a foundational document, and it's so important for everybody to understand it and understand what it means to them and their lives. I don't think people appreciate that. Like you said earlier about all the people who refer to the Constitution, but they haven't read it. So they act as if they've read it, but they really haven't. Mm-hmm. And especially when we get to teenagers really don't know. A lot of teenagers in the United States don't really understand a lot about the world. Mm-hmm. They're not curious about the world. They're curious about a lot of things on TikTok and all that stuff, but they're not curious about the world and about why this country is so important, why having been born here was so important to our lives, and being able to be an American, how that differentiates things for us. It's a sacred document, and we need to understand how sacred it is and how important it is. And until a person really digests it, they don't get it. They just don't get it. Again, that's one of the reasons why I used historical figures to try to bring life to it. So, because that way, in one chapter at a time, each chapter would deal with an amendment and try to bring life to that amendment through that person's eyes that these kids would meet. And so that I think what happens then is it brings it to life for people. I'll give you an example. Another adult who's very educated, she's got a doctorate, and she said, Gary, I was reading the book. She said, I couldn't wait to get to the next chapter because I wanted to see who the kids are going to run into next. Because she said each person was interesting in their own right. I'll give you a good example of that. Frederick Douglass is in the book, and they start out by actually, they find themselves going over across the ocean, and they're above the ocean, and suddenly there's a ship underneath them. It's a slave ship bringing slaves from Africa, and they can smell the odors coming from the ship. And Frederick Douglass explains, the men are on the top deck, the women and kids are below. But they're like sardines there. And he said the food, there's no just awful food for them. Many of them will die on the trip. They won't even make it to the United States. And even a number of the people who are working the ship will die also. And that they're so angry about the fact that the water is terrible, the food is terrible, there's not enough, and they're suffering from dysentery and that they punish the slaves who are already punished as it is on the ship. And they rape the women on the ship, the women slaves. He brings that to life. He then takes them to Charleston, where they go to a slave auction, and they see a slave driver who's walking around one of the slaves, and he's talking about the guy as if he's an animal. Well, again, a person reading it, they start seeing, oh my God, look at how awful. And in fact, Callie, one of the kids in the book, she's crying because she said, I can't believe they would treat a human being like this. See, in this way, when somebody's reading it, they really understand why the end of slavery is so important. And then later on, they see Frederick Douglass debating Susan B. Anthony because she's saying, well, why do you former slaves get the vote before women? Because if you remember, women didn't get the vote until 1920, until the 20th Amendment. They didn't get the vote until much later, much after African Americans got the vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And, voting is important, having a choice. I always say this, we are all stewards of our democracy, and democracies can end. That's the important thing that people can learn from your book. Democracies can end in an instant. We saw Hungary fall to fascism, authoritarianism over COVID. And all it took was a crisis and martial law and game over.
And it's not just, we see that happening here. We see that happening. In fact, John Kennedy ends up taking them to talk about the poll taxes and that. And we have still, so many things. You have to have a driver's license or identification to vote. And Kennedy points out to them, he says, yeah, okay, it may sound simple that, to get an identification, he said, because many African Americans don't drive. And he said, but they could get a personal ID, an ID. But to get an ID, you have to have a birth certificate. And he said, you may not know this, but in many places, a birth certificate may cost $30 to get a birth certificate. And so, and a lot of people can't afford to spend that $30 for the birth certificate. So we're having that happen today, where that whole idea of poll taxes, of requiring birth certificates, all kinds of things that prevent people from voting. And that's happening today, where in some states, certain politicians are trying to prevent people from voting because they happen to think they're going to vote for someone other than them.
Yeah. Lots of gamemanship going on. In fact, Texas is right now in the midst of redoing their gerrymandering? I think that's the abuse.
It's awful.
They're trying to re-gerrymander their politics and stuff. So, yeah.
That's happening in Texas right now. In Texas, I think they're looking at, it was 5 other districts that they're looking at that were formerly able to vote, were voting largely Democratic, redistricting them so that they would vote Republican, so they would have 5 more legislators who are Republican coming from Texas. Yeah. And that's gerrymandering is an awful thing.
Yeah, it is a crazy thing. You see some of the ways they curve the lines and stuff where you're just like, yeah, you guys are working really hard on all that, aren't you? Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. Give us your .coms one more time so that people can...
It's theconstitutionkids.com.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it, Gary.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thanks, friends, for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss. Pick up Gary's book wherever fine books are sold. And please, folks, if you haven't sat down and read the Constitution, sit down and read it. You can read it through Gary's book, and probably a great way to learn because you get it through that kind of third-person visual story. And read the Federalist Papers. For the love of God, make it stop what's going on in 2025. Once your rights are gone, they're gone for a very long time. And there's a lot of blood, death, and sweat that will happen. The one thing man can learn from his history, folks, is that man never learns from his history. And that's why we end up with fascism and authoritarian again. And fascism and authoritarian never ends up pretty. And a lot of people die, and a lot of people get hurt, and a lot of people suffer. And we don't want to see that coming to America, although it stands at our shores now. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss1, and Facebook.com/Chris Voss. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you next time. Great show, man.